Australian companies are falling behind their peers when it comes to using data analytics in business. The research from Melbourne Business School and A.T. Kearney found only 6% of companies surveyed globally use analytics to gather useful information to its full capacity. I spoke to Professor Ujwal Kayende, founding director of the Centre of Business Analytics, earlier on. Ujwal, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Firstly, can you explain to us what exactly is data analytics?
It's a terrific question. Thanks, Danica, for asking the question. So data analytics is really about taking the data that organizations actually have, and they're typically the data are the data that consumers drop when they interact with companies on the web or in their retail stores or in online stores. And those data are then used to find insights on what consumers are doing and why they're doing the things that they're doing. And that really constitutes, what data analytics is. The critical thing in data analytics is to understand why people behave the way they do. And you're trying to understand that with the power of data. So I think that's really what data analytics does. What it isn't is just dashboards, which is what a lot of organizations think it is, just dashboards and numbers. That's not what data analytics is. That's just numbers. And I think what you need is to generate those insights, and that's where you start getting the power of data analytics.
So how critical then is data analytics for a company?
I think modern companies are much more technology-based than they used to be. And so if you're technology-based, there's a lot of data that's being dropped into your organization all the time. If you're not actually using the data, then you're leaving a lot of money on the table. So I think, every company in the world now is using technology in some form or the other. But if you're not actually harnessing the data that's being dropped as a result of that technology infrastructure, then I think you're just leaving so much potential on the table. So it is absolutely critical. In fact, The Economist has gone so far as to call it the new oil. And I think that's about right.
Take us through the research that has been conducted showing that Australian companies are falling behind their peers when it does come to data analytics. How far behind are they?
Well, that's a great question. So this is the second year of the study that we conduct, annually. And essentially, we're trying to understand how companies are extracting value from analytics. So we surveyed actually over 350 companies across the world with a median revenue of about $1 billion. So they ranged from smaller companies to larger companies as well. And what we were really trying to understand is how companies are able to extract that value, how they're able to translate the investments that they're making in analytics into financial performance. And that was our main goal in the study. Now, Australian companies are falling behind, largely because, that's just come out of the study, because one of the ways in which you can extract value from analytics is to actually have very strong leadership support. In fact, that's not just one of the ways, that's the most critical thing that a company can do. So in fact, one of the key findings from the study is that in organizations where analytics teams are actually led by somebody in the C-suite, they actually extract about twice as much value as organizations where analytics teams are just led by managers. And one of the reasons for that is because when you're in the C-suite, you've got a whole of company perspective, whole of organization perspective, and you're able to understand what the strategy of the organization is. So if these analytics investments are not necessarily aligned with the strategy of the company, then you're not actually getting much value. So what we found in our study was that Australian companies don't necessarily tend to be, the type of companies where the analytics teams are led by the C-suite. And so I think that's one of the reasons why Australian companies are falling behind. The other reason why Australian companies are falling behind is Australian companies tend to be less experimental and less technology-based than global companies, in particular U.S. companies. The U.S. companies are just a little bit further ahead on the analytics maturity curve, on the technology maturity curve, than Australian companies are. And so if you're not experimental, which is really the best thing about data analytics is that you can actually do experiments and then generate data to be able to understand what works and what doesn't work. And a lot of Australian companies are really not there in terms of having that experimental culture. So I think those are the sort of reasons that we've found in our study why Australian companies are falling behind. But there's no reason why we can't catch up.
Well, that was going to be my next question. How can Australian companies catch up?
I think one of the critical things Australian companies have to do is to start getting that understanding of the importance of data in the C-suite. It's not as if there isn't the importance, but there are a lot of things that C-suite and CEOs and boards have to do to be able to set up the right structure within the organization. So there's got to be leadership understanding of what analytics is. And unfortunately, a lot of leaders of companies still believe that analytics is just dashboards. It's far more than that. Dashboards is just the first step of analytics. So I think there needs to be a greater understanding of what analytics is amongst leaders and amongst board members as well. The second thing that needs to happen is you need to create that culture of being evidence-based in your decision-making. And that doesn't happen all the time because organizations are working at a fast pace. But organizations like Amazon are incredibly evidence-based, and they work in a very fast-paced world as well. And they're very evidence-based because that's the culture of the company. And I think not all Australian companies are like that. You also need to have the right talent and skills, and that's critical. And then, of course, there's hygiene factors like you need to have the right data infrastructure. And I think a lot of Australian companies do have that data infrastructure, but they lack that understanding at the top of what analytics is and what it can actually bring to the company. We've been doing a lot of executive education programs, and we see this all the time where there are a lot of senior executives who don't necessarily understand the full depth and breadth of what data can do for their organizations. But it's not a huge challenge. They don't need to become technical data scientists. That's not required at all. You just need to have a mindset change, and that's really what Australian companies can do. And I think we'll get there because there's a lot of pressure from worldwide companies, global companies, and I think Australian companies just have to get there to be able to compete. Not just in the global marketplace, but also in the Australian marketplace. With companies like DoorDash and Amazon coming in here, we just have to change that mindset to be able to compete.
Certainly a fascinating study and an interesting discussion. Professor Ujjwal Kayende, thank you so much for your time today.
It's been my pleasure, Tanika. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me.